Many things that I want to express, like when I take on a role, and I go through this, I guess I'm just nervous that I'm not going to be able to.
In 1993, at 2:40 a.m., a 19-year-old young man called emergency services, his voice shaking, "My brother is dying." That young man was Joaquin Phoenix. 26 years later, the same man stood on the Oscar stage after losing over 50 pounds, 23 kilograms, winning 73 major awards for a role born from pain, yet he didn't speak about success. He spoke about suffering, guilt, and compassion. This is not a success story. This is a story about surviving yourself. Before the world knew him as Joker, Joaquin Phoenix was already living inside one. By the age of 8, he had lived in cult communes, slept in cars, and learned that silence was safer than questions. By 19, he watched the person who held his world together collapse on a sidewalk and never stand up again. The emergency call was recorded, leaked, played on television. Grief didn't end that night. It became a permanent roommate. Hollywood offered him fame. He answered with discomfort. He chose roles no one wanted to love, emperors consumed by envy, musicians drowning in addiction, men quietly falling apart. He didn't chase likability. He chased truth, even when it cost him everything else. In 2008, at the height of his career, Joaquin publicly destroyed his own image. He appeared drunk, hostile, incoherent. The internet laughed. Critics mocked. What they didn't know was that this wasn't a breakdown, it was a mirror. Then came Joker. To prepare, he starved his body until his spine surfaced through skin. He isolated himself. He laughed alone in empty rooms until the laughter stopped sounding like acting. The film made over $1 billion worldwide. But Joaquin didn't celebrate. Because the real performance wasn't on screen. It was a man asking a dangerous question. What happens when pain is not healed, only witnessed? Joaquin Phoenix was not born into stability. He was born into movement. Into uncertainty. Into a world where nothing stayed long enough to feel safe. His original name was Joaquin Raphael Bottom, a name that already suggested a life lived on the margins. His parents were young, idealistic, and searching for meaning. That search led them away from society, and straight into a religious cult known as Children of God. The group promised purity, truth, and salvation. What it delivered was isolation, control, and fear. Joaquin was still a child when he learned the first rule of survival: don't ask questions. The family moved constantly, across South America, across the United States. No permanent home. No stable school. Sometimes no electricity. Sometimes no food. Privacy did not exist. Choice did not exist. Everything, from beliefs to daily routines, was dictated. For a sensitive child, this kind of environment doesn't just shape behavior. It rewires the nervous system. Joaquin learned to observe instead of speak. To feel deeply, but silently. To disappear into himself. That inner world became his refuge. When his parents finally escaped the cult, freedom didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as confusion. They changed their last name from Bottom to Phoenix, a symbol of rebirth. But rebirth is never clean. It leaves scars. In Los Angeles, the Phoenix children were pushed toward acting, not for ambition, but for survival. Commercials. Small TV roles. Any paycheck that kept the family afloat. That was when River Phoenix emerged. River was everything Joaquin was not allowed to be. Charismatic. Fearless. Brilliant. Hollywood noticed immediately. River became the provider. The protector. The center of gravity. And Joaquin? He orbited quietly. He admired his brother. Loved him. But also learned, very early, what it meant to live in someone else's shadow. While River shined outward, Joaquin absorbed inward. He watched how fame changed rooms. How adults lied more easily around success. How pressure disguised itself as praise. He also watched his brother fracture. By his teenage years, Joaquin could already sense the contradiction: the world celebrates talent, but consumes the human being behind it. Then came the night that ended childhood forever. October 31, 1993. Outside a nightclub in West Hollywood. River Phoenix collapsed. Joaquin was there. 19 years old. No script. No rehearsal. He dialed 911. His voice cracked. He begged. He repeated himself because no one was moving fast enough. River died on the pavement. And somehow, cruelly, that call did not stay private. It leaked. It was played on television. A teenager's worst moment turned into public audio. That night didn't just take his brother. It shattered Joaquin's sense of reality. Guilt moved in. So did silence. He left Hollywood. Left the country. Disappeared into grief. And this is where most stories would rush forward, toward recovery, toward hope. But Joaquin didn't heal. He carried the fracture forward. What survived from his childhood wasn't confidence. It wasn't ambition. It was empathy for the broken. Years later, when audiences would say his performances felt uncomfortable, what they were really sensing was this. A man who had learned, very early, how to sit inside pain without looking away. This wasn't training. It was conditioning. And it would become the foundation of everything he ever created. When Joaquin Phoenix returned to acting after his brother's death, it was not a comeback. There was no announcement, no declaration of resilience, no public redemption arc. It was simply a quiet re-entry into a world he never fully trusted in the first place. Hollywood remembered River. Joaquin remembered the pavement, the sirens, the helpless waiting. Acting was no longer a dream. It became a negotiation with survival. In the years that followed, Joaquin did not chase leading man roles. He avoided charm. Avoided safety. Instead, he gravitated toward characters who carried internal fractures, men driven by obsession, shame, moral ambiguity. This wasn't strategy. It was instinct. He could not pretend to be someone whole, because wholeness felt dishonest. Every role became a place to deposit emotions he had never been taught how to release. Early performances unsettled people. Directors noticed that Joaquin didn't perform emotions on cue, he let them arrive when they were ready. Sometimes that meant silence. Sometimes volatility. Sometimes discomfort that lingered in a room long after the scene ended. He wasn't interested in being liked. He was interested in being accurate. This was the beginning of his private rule: never protect the audience from the truth. In 2000, Gladiator changed everything. Joaquin played Emperor Commodus, a man poisoned by insecurity, starved of approval, rotting from the inside while holding absolute power. On paper, it was a villain. On screen, it was something far more disturbing. Joaquin didn't make Commodus evil. He made him needy. Afraid. Desperate to be loved by a father who never gave him approval. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and instant visibility, but more importantly, it revealed something essential about Joaquin's path. He could transform inner weakness into cinematic force. Success arrived, but it didn't bring peace. With recognition came expectation. Interviews. Red carpets. Narratives he was expected to repeat. Joaquin resisted all of it. Fame felt invasive. Praise felt suspicious. He began to pull away from the machinery that celebrated him. Not because he rejected acting, but because he rejected the idea that success required accessibility. Instead of capitalizing on momentum, he chose risk. In Signs, he played grief held under control. In The Village, fear wrapped in innocence. Then came Walk the Line. To portray Johnny Cash, Joaquin did not rely on imitation. He learned to sing. He learned to sit inside addiction, relapse, self-loathing. He lost himself in the rhythms of dependency and regret. For months, he lived as a man constantly on the edge of collapse. The result was magnetic. Another Oscar nomination. More acclaim. More pressure. But the deeper he went, the clearer the contradiction became. Joaquin was gaining recognition for disappearing into other people's damage, while his own remained unresolved. Acting gave him permission to feel, but not to heal. By the mid-2000s, the gap between his inner world and public image became unbearable. Joaquin felt trapped inside a version of himself that audiences expected. The thoughtful actor. The intense performer. The reluctant star. None of it felt real enough. He wanted out. Not from acting, but from the illusion surrounding it. So he did something no one understood. At the height of his credibility, Joaquin Phoenix publicly announced he was quitting acting to pursue a career in hip-hop. He appeared on talk shows disheveled, hostile, incoherent. He gained weight. Grew a thick beard. Delivered awkward, uncomfortable interviews. The media framed it as a breakdown. Fans expressed concern. Critics mocked him. Clips went viral. His reputation collapsed in real time. What the world didn't know was that this was intentional. The project, later revealed as I'm Still Here, was a performance without a script for the audience. Joaquin was testing something dangerous: how quickly admiration turns into ridicule, how fragile public respect truly is, and how much cruelty people justify when they believe someone has fallen. He let himself be humiliated. He absorbed the laughter. He watched how easily empathy disappeared. For Joaquin, this wasn't self-destruction. It was exposure therapy. A way to strip away the false self entirely. To see what remained when approval was gone. When the truth came out, that it had been a constructed experiment, the damage was already done. Trust had eroded. Industry relationships strained. But Joaquin didn't rush to repair them. The point was never to be forgiven. The point was to understand. And what he understood was devastatingly simple: the world does not want authenticity. It wants coherence. It wants stories that make sense. Joaquin Phoenix did not make sense. And he was finally okay with that. This period cemented his own path. Not a career trajectory, but a philosophy. From this point forward, Joaquin would only choose projects that demanded honesty, even if that honesty was uncomfortable, even if it cost him relevance, even if it required disappearing for years at a time. He stopped explaining himself. Stopped correcting misunderstandings. He let silence do the work. What emerged from this phase was not clarity, but commitment. Commitment to truth over likability. Depth over momentum. Integrity over stability. Joaquin Phoenix was no longer trying to survive the industry. He was preparing, unknowingly, for the role that would force him to confront everything he had been carrying since childhood. A role that would not ask him to perform pain, but to unlock it. And the world was not ready for what would come next. By the late 2000s, Joaquin Phoenix had reached a place most actors spend their entire lives chasing. His name carried weight. Directors trusted him. Studios knew his presence alone could elevate a project. Award nominations followed him like a shadow. On the surface, this was the peak. The kind of moment biographies rush through quickly, labeling it success before moving on. But for Joaquin, this phase was not a summit. It was a pressure chamber. After Walk the Line, Joaquin became synonymous with intensity. Not loud intensity, not theatrical excess, but something quieter and more unsettling. He played men who seemed functional on the outside while quietly unraveling underneath. Characters who didn't ask for sympathy, yet demanded attention. Films like Reservation Road, Two Lovers, and We Own the Night positioned him as one of the most serious actors of his generation. Critics praised his restraint. Audiences felt his gravity. Hollywood offered him more of the same. But repetition terrified him. Each new role came with an invisible expectation: deliver another haunting performance, sink deeper, disappear further. Joaquin complied, but with growing resistance. He understood something most people didn't see. The industry wasn't rewarding his talent. It was feeding on his willingness to suffer in public. Pain had become his currency. The more authentic his performances became, the more artificial the surrounding world felt. Press tours required soundbites. Red carpets demanded charm. Success required accessibility. Joaquin withdrew. He spoke less. He avoided promotional cycles whenever possible. Fame felt less like recognition and more like intrusion. The world wanted him visible. He wanted to remain intact. In Two Lovers, Joaquin portrayed a man suspended between obligation and desire, suffocating under expectations he didn't choose. The performance was intimate, restrained, and devastating. It mirrored his own state more than he was willing to admit. The film didn't break box office records, but it revealed the core of his artistic identity. Joaquin wasn't interested in transformation for spectacle. He was interested in emotional truth, even when it was small, uncomfortable, and unresolved. By this point, awards had lost their meaning. Applause no longer registered as validation. Joaquin had already learned the lesson: success doesn't advertise, recognition does not equal relief. If anything, it amplifies unresolved pain. The higher he climbed, the more exposed he felt. There was nowhere left to hide. And yet, the world kept calling this period his golden era. Inside, Joaquin felt increasingly hollow. Acting gave him purpose, but not peace. Each role demanded emotional excavation, but there was no structure to put himself back together afterward. He wasn't breaking down in visible ways. There were no public meltdowns, no scandals. just a slow erosion. A sense that he was living inside a system that praised vulnerability while offering no protection for it. This was the illusion of glory, being celebrated for depth while drowning in it. Then came a choice that seemed, to outsiders, irrational. At a moment when his credibility was at its strongest, Joaquin stepped away again. He rejected safe projects. Turned down roles designed to secure his legacy. He didn't announce a reason. He didn't explain himself. He simply disappeared from the rhythm of constant productivity that Hollywood depends on. When he returned, it wasn't with reassurance. It was with confrontation. Films like The Master marked a shift. Joaquin no longer played characters audiences could easily empathize with. Freddie Quell was volatile, wounded, unpredictable. Watching him felt invasive. Joaquin stripped away likability entirely. The performance earned him yet another Academy Award nomination, but more importantly, it marked a turning point. He was no longer interested in being admired. He wanted to unsettle. This was not ambition. It was necessity. The peak of Joaquin Phoenix's career did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing on a cliff edge, realizing that applause could not keep you from falling. The industry called this phase success because it needed a label. Joaquin experienced it as a test. How much of himself could he give before there was nothing left? What made this period dangerous wasn't the workload. It was the silence between projects. The moments when the costumes came off and there was no character to inhabit. No script to guide emotion. Just the accumulated weight of everything he had never processed. The truth was simple and terrifying. Joaquin Phoenix had mastered the art of portraying broken men, but he had not yet learned how to live as one. And that unresolved tension, between acclaim and emptiness, between mastery and fragility, was quietly pulling him toward the darkest chapter of his life. A chapter where the line between performance and reality would dissolve completely. Where pain would no longer be interpreted, but embodied. The world believed Joaquin Phoenix was at his peak. In reality, he was approaching the collapse that would redefine him forever. What happens when a man spends his entire life learning how to inhabit pain, but never learns how to leave it? What happens when suffering is no longer something you visit for a role, but something you live inside, day after day, without applause, without structure, without an ending? For Joaquin Phoenix, the collapse did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as exhaustion. By the early 2010s, he had already proven everything an actor could prove. Range, depth, fearlessness, respect. And yet, something inside him was eroding. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was the quiet kind of breakdown, the kind that doesn't alert anyone until it's already too deep to climb out easily. Joaquin wasn't losing control. He was losing separation. The line between who he was and what he performed had begun to dissolve. Acting had always been his way of surviving emotion. But survival is not the same as healing. Each role required him to reopen wounds that had never closed: abandonment, guilt, grief, shame. The industry praised his bravery, unaware that he wasn't summoning pain, he was reliving it. Over and over again. This was the unspoken cost of authenticity. Joaquin began to feel trapped inside an image of himself as the intense one. The actor who goes further. The one who sacrifices more. The one who disappears. What no one asked was whether there would be anything left when the disappearance became permanent. He started to question not just his career, but the moral weight of what he was doing. Was he transforming pain into art, or was he exploiting his own trauma until it hollowed him out? The questions had no clean answers. So he did what he had learned to do best. He leaned in. When he agreed to portray Arthur Fleck in Joker, it wasn't because the role promised accolades. It was because it terrified him. Joaquin almost walked away multiple times during pre-production. He sensed what the character would demand. Not technique. Not preparation. But surrender. Arthur Fleck wasn't a role you could perform from a distance. He lived too close to the fractures Joaquin had carried since childhood. The preparation was brutal. Joaquin lost more than 50 pounds. His body thinned until his bones began to dictate his posture. Hunger altered his psychology. He became irritable. Isolated. Unstable. But this wasn't method acting for spectacle. It was a physical manifestation of an internal truth. Arthur Fleck, like Joaquin, existed in a body that felt wrong, exposed, insufficient. He studied neurological disorders that cause involuntary laughter. He practiced movements alone, in silence, letting the character's physicality emerge organically. There was no safety net. No formula. Joaquin wasn't building Arthur. He was uncovering him. During filming, the atmosphere on set was tense. Joaquin improvised frequently, not to disrupt, but because structure felt false. He needed unpredictability. Control would have protected him, and protection was exactly what the role rejected. Scenes stretched beyond what was written. Emotional states shifted without warning. Co-stars struggled to anticipate him. That discomfort became part of the performance. But the most disturbing part wasn't what happened on camera. It was what happened when the camera stopped. Joaquin stayed in character longer than intended. Not by design. By necessity. Arthur's loneliness echoed too closely with his own. The laughter that began as research started to surface uninvited. Movement patterns lingered. Isolation deepened. This was no longer acting as release. It was acting as exposure. And yet, Joaquin did not stop. Why? Because Arthur Fleck wasn't just a character. He was a question Joaquin had been avoiding for decades. What happens to a sensitive child when the world offers no containment for his pain? What happens when compassion is absent, systems fail, and suffering is mocked instead of met? Joker wasn't asking audiences to sympathize with violence. It was asking them to witness neglect. As the film progressed, Joaquin realized something unsettling. He wasn't interpreting Arthur's descent. He understood it. Not intellectually. Viscerally. The loneliness. The confusion. The rage that grows not from evil, but from invisibility. Arthur Fleck was not a monster created overnight. He was a man eroded slowly, systematically, until something snapped. That realization did not empower Joaquin. It frightened him. Because if the distance between himself and Arthur Fleck was thinner than he had believed, then the performance was not just dangerous. It was revealing. The question that haunted him throughout filming was simple and unbearable. When the role ends, will I know how to come back? The industry was already preparing its praise. Critics sensed something historic. Studio executives saw awards. Joaquin felt none of it. He felt exposed. Raw. Unfinished. Joker was not catharsis. It was confrontation. And confrontation, without resolution, has a cost. By the time filming wrapped, Joaquin was not celebrating. He was depleted. Physically weakened. Emotionally stripped. The character had given him nothing to hide behind. For the first time, acting had not offered him escape. It had forced him to stand face to face with the darkest parts of himself, and remain there. This was not the end of the collapse. It was only the moment it became unavoidable. What happens after the world applauds your pain? What happens when the thing that almost breaks you is crowned as greatness? When Joker was released, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The film crossed $1 billion worldwide. Critics called it fearless, disturbing, transformative. Joaquin Phoenix was suddenly everywhere, his image, his performance, his body reduced to a symbol of artistic sacrifice. The industry framed it as a triumph. Joaquin experienced it as exposure on a global scale. The applause felt invasive. People didn't see Arthur Fleck anymore. They saw Joaquin's suffering as a product. Interviews dissected his weight loss, his mental state, his process. Questions were asked casually, as if self-erasure were a technique rather than a risk. Joaquin answered carefully, often withdrawing, often deflecting. He sensed a familiar pattern returning: admiration without protection, curiosity without care. Award season arrived like a tidal wave. Joaquin attended ceremonies reluctantly, moving through rooms filled with praise that felt strangely hollow. Each standing ovation reminded him of something uncomfortable. The world celebrated the result, not the cost. No one asked what it takes to walk away from a character that close to the bone. No one asked whether leaving was even possible. Then came the Oscars. When Joaquin's name was announced, there was no visible shock. No release. He stood, walked to the stage, and accepted the statue as if it were an obligation rather than a reward. His speech did not follow the expected arc. He did not thank the industry. He did not celebrate himself. Instead, he spoke about inequality, about cruelty, about the way society punishes those who fall outside its definitions of normal. What he was really doing was redirecting attention away from himself. Because the truth was this: winning did not resolve anything. It intensified it. After the ceremony, when the lights dimmed and the rooms emptied, Joaquin returned to silence. The adrenaline faded. The validation evaporated. What remained was the question he had been avoiding since filming ended: who am I when I am no longer Arthur Fleck? And more frightening, what if Arthur never really leaves? The post-Joker period was not dramatic in the way tabloids understand drama. There were no public spirals, no scandals. Instead, there was withdrawal. Joaquin became more private, more selective, more cautious with his energy. He spoke openly about discomfort, about fear, about how close he had come to losing himself. He admitted that the role had affected him deeply, that the boundaries between character and self had blurred in ways he did not anticipate. For the first time, Joaquin began to articulate something he had always embodied but never named: vulnerability without performance. He acknowledged therapy. He spoke about the importance of support systems. He no longer romanticized suffering. The man who had once believed that pain was the price of truth began to question that belief. Was suffering necessary, or had it simply become familiar? This was the real aftermath of Joker. Not the awards. Not the acclaim. But the reckoning. Joaquin realized that he had spent decades using art as a container for pain, assuming that if pain had a purpose, it would not consume him. But purpose does not guarantee safety. Meaning does not equal sustainability. At some point, even the most profound expression can become self-erasure if there is no path back. The collapse, then, was not a fall from grace. It was a confrontation with a lifelong pattern. From childhood onward, Joaquin had learned to survive by adapting inwardly. Silence in the cult. Observation in poverty. Disappearance in fame. Each phase required him to shrink, to absorb, to endure. Acting became another version of this adaptation, an elegant one, a celebrated one, but still rooted in endurance rather than care. The question that opened this chapter now demanded an answer: what happens when you live inside pain long enough that it becomes home? For Joaquin Phoenix, the answer was sobering. You either find a way to step out, or you disappear entirely. This realization marked the true bottom of the collapse. Not exhaustion, not fear, but clarity. A quiet, unsettling clarity that said, continuing this way is not bravery. It is avoidance disguised as dedication. And for the first time, Joaquin did not respond by leaning deeper into darkness. He paused. He slowed. He chose absence over exposure. This was not recovery yet. There was no neat resolution, no transformation montage. But there was something new, something fragile and unfamiliar: restraint. A willingness to stop proving himself. A refusal to let pain be the only language he spoke fluently. The darkest chapter of Joaquin Phoenix's life did not end with Joker. It ended with a decision. A decision to stop using suffering as currency. To stop confusing depth with destruction. The collapse had done its work. It had stripped away illusion, acclaim, and justification. What remained was a man standing at a crossroads, finally aware that survival alone was no longer enough. The next step would not be about performance. It would be about return. A turning point is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with music or clarity or certainty. More often, it arrives as restraint. As the decision to stop. To pause long enough to hear what has been buried under years of noise, expectation, and endurance. For Joaquin Phoenix, rebirth did not begin with hope. It began with honesty. After Joker, Joaquin stepped back in ways that confused the industry. There was no immediate follow-up designed to capitalize on momentum. No attempt to cement his status as an untouchable icon. He declined offers that would have guaranteed continued visibility. This was not avoidance. It was preservation. For the first time, Joaquin was choosing distance not out of fear, but out of care. He began speaking differently. Less defensively. Less cryptically. In interviews, he no longer framed suffering as a badge of honor. He spoke about limits. About responsibility, to himself, to the people around him, to the younger version of himself who never had protection. This shift was subtle, but profound. The man who had once believed that truth required self-destruction was now questioning that equation. Rebirth, for Joaquin, did not mean abandoning darkness. It meant redefining his relationship to it. He continued to choose challenging roles, but with a different orientation. Not to disappear, but to return. Not to excavate trauma endlessly, but to engage with complexity while remaining grounded. This distinction mattered. It was the difference between expression and erosion. In Come On, Come On, Joaquin played a character radically unlike Arthur Fleck. A quiet, attentive uncle navigating parenthood, uncertainty, and emotional presence. The performance was restrained, tender, almost disarming. There were no explosions. No breakdowns. No spectacle. And yet, it was one of the most revealing roles of his career. For the first time, Joaquin allowed himself to be gentle on screen. That gentleness was not accidental. It reflected a deeper shift in his life. Joaquin had become a father. Responsibility took on a new meaning. Pain could no longer be his primary language. Survival was no longer enough. Presence mattered more than intensity. Care mattered more than depth. This change did not erase his past. It integrated it. Joaquin's activism also evolved during this period. His advocacy for animal rights, environmental responsibility, and social justice became less performative and more embodied. He did not separate art from ethics. His choices, what he ate, what he wore, what projects he supported, became extensions of a personal code. Not to be admired, but to be aligned. The industry, accustomed to consuming his extremes, struggled to categorize this version of Joaquin Phoenix. He was no longer the tortured genius archetype. He wasn't chasing relevance. He wasn't withdrawing into obscurity either. He existed somewhere quieter. More grounded. Less dramatic. More real. This was the rebirth. Not a transformation into someone new, but a return to something essential that had been buried under years of coping. The sensitive child who learned to observe. The man who valued truth over spectacle. The artist who no longer needed pain to justify his existence. The turning point was not marked by a single decision, but by a pattern of choices. Saying no. Choosing silence. Prioritizing health over acclaim. Allowing himself to be unfinished without immediately turning that incompleteness into art. This was a radical act in an industry built on constant output. Joaquin Phoenix did not reinvent himself. He reclaimed himself. And in doing so, he quietly challenged one of the most dangerous myths of creative culture, that greatness requires suffering, and that healing dulls depth. Joaquin's later work disproved that assumption. It showed that presence can be just as powerful as intensity. That restraint can carry as much weight as collapse. Rebirth, in this sense, was not an escape from darkness. It was a choice not to live there permanently. Joaquin did not become happier in a simplistic way. He became clearer. Clearer about his limits. Clearer about his values. Clearer about the cost of ignoring both. The turning point was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of alignment. And for a man who had spent most of his life surviving fragmentation, alignment was revolutionary. What followed was not a new ascent, but a different kind of legacy. One built not on how far he could go into pain, but on how honestly he could live alongside it without being consumed. The story was no longer about collapse. It was about return. After the turning point, Joaquin Phoenix did not disappear. He also did not re-emerge as a reinvented icon. Instead, he settled into something far less visible and far more difficult to maintain: consistency without spectacle. This phase of his life was quieter, but not smaller. In many ways, it was the first time his outer life resembled his inner values. Joaquin's career choices became slower and more deliberate. He no longer measured success by momentum or relevance. Projects were selected based on alignment rather than opportunity. He worked less, but with greater intention. This restraint confused an industry addicted to constant output, but it solidified his reputation as someone who could not be bought by timing or trends. His influence extended beyond the screen. Joaquin's public presence, when it appeared, carried moral weight. He used visibility not to promote himself, but to redirect attention toward issues he believed demanded urgency: animal rights, environmental sustainability, systemic inequality. What made his advocacy different was its coherence. He lived the values he spoke about, quietly and consistently, without packaging them as inspiration. This authenticity resonated. Not because it was loud, but because it was rare. In film culture, Joaquin Phoenix came to represent an alternative model of greatness. Not the hyperproductive star. Not the endlessly accessible celebrity. But the artist who prioritizes integrity over expansion. Younger actors cited his career as proof that it was possible to resist the machinery without disappearing from it. That one could choose depth without self-destruction. His performances in this later phase carried a different energy. The tension was still there, but it was no longer feral. It was contained, grounded. Joaquin no longer bled onto the screen. He breathed. He listened. He allowed silence to speak without filling it with anguish. This shift changed how audiences experienced him. The discomfort remained, but it was no longer destabilizing. It invited reflection rather than shock. The legacy Joaquin was building was not about roles alone. It was about permission. Permission for artists to protect themselves. Permission to step back without apology. Permission to refuse narratives that equate pain with authenticity. Joaquin Phoenix did not preach these ideas. He embodied them. Over time, that embodiment became more influential than any speech or award. His story complicated the traditional arc of success. There was no final victory, no permanent arrival. Instead, there was maintenance, attention, choice, a commitment to staying human inside systems that reward dehumanization. This kind of legacy is difficult to quantify, but it endures precisely because it resists simplification. Joaquin Phoenix did not leave behind a formula. He left behind an example. An example of what it looks like to take responsibility for one's inner life while still engaging fully with the world. To acknowledge damage without letting it define the future. To carry darkness without becoming consumed by it. In an era obsessed with visibility, his restraint became a statement. In a culture that monetizes vulnerability, his boundaries became radical. Joaquin's life after collapse was not dramatic enough to trend, but it was meaningful enough to matter. And that may be his most lasting contribution. Not the awards. Not the performances alone. But the quiet demonstration that depth does not require destruction, and that survival, when guided by integrity, can evolve into something far more powerful. Joaquin Phoenix's story does not end with triumph. It ends with understanding. Understanding that pain, when ignored, will find a way to speak. That talent, when built on endurance alone, eventually demands a reckoning. And that surviving is not the same as living, no matter how impressive survival may look from the outside. For most of his life, Joaquin learned how to disappear inside roles, inside silence, inside expectation. The world rewarded him for it. Applause followed every descent. But the deepest lesson came only when the descent could no longer continue. When collapse stopped being a phase and became a warning. What makes Joaquin Phoenix extraordinary is not how far he was willing to go into darkness. It is that he chose not to stay there. He did not erase his past. He did not outgrow his wounds. He learned how to carry them without letting them lead. And in doing so, he offered something rare in a culture obsessed with transformation: permission to remain human. You don't have to be healed to be worthy. You don't have to be whole to be honest. And you don't have to destroy yourself to create something meaningful. Joaquin Phoenix is not a symbol of perfection. He is proof that depth can coexist with care. That art can emerge from brokenness without demanding sacrifice as payment. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath it all. The goal was never to conquer the darkness. It was to walk through it, and come back.